It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and whatever shiny objects happen to strike my fancy. Today, my special guest is Christian B. Miller, and we're going to be discussing his brand new book, The Character Gap, How Good Are We? Christian, thanks for joining us on today's show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, first off, Christian, this is your first time on my show, so I'd love to just give the listeners a bit of context for who you are. So start us off with a bit about your education background and what are some of your specific areas of expertise and study?
Sure, I'd love to. So I grew up in Florida, and I went off to college in 1995 to Princeton up in New Jersey, where I majored in philosophy. I had a really good experience there and just loved philosophy so much I didn't want to stop. So I went right from Princeton to Notre Dame to get my PhD in philosophy. That took me 5 years, and I focused specifically on ethics, and even more specifically on the question of where does morality come from? Is morality just subjective or relative, or does it have a more objective foundation to morality? That's what I did my dissertation on. And from there, I was just incredibly fortunate or providentially blessed to end up at Wake Forest University. That they hired me after 5 years at Notre Dame, and I started as an assistant professor of philosophy, and I've been there ever since. This is my 15th year at Wake Forest. Tremendous school, loved every year I've been here. And I've continued to specialize mainly in ethics, focused on the topic of character, which we'll be talking a lot about in a moment, but also that question of where does morality come from, the foundations of morality, the relationship between morality and God, so bridging a little bit of philosophy, religion, and ethics. So does God serve as a foundation of morality, or does morality exist independently of God? So it all ends up coming back to the topic of ethics for me.
Well, and kind of thinking before your college, master's, doctoral level sort of education, where did this fascination with character, ethics, philosophy, where did that start? Was this something that started emerging at an early age for you, or was this something that developed in later years? I'm just curious, kind of where was that spark or catalyst that got you moving down this path?
Sure. So the character interest came later, but the philosophy interest came very early. So that really started in, I would say, the beginning of high school, where I was exposed to C.S. Lewis, and like so many other people, just was captivated by what he had to say. Mere Christianity was a kind of pivotal book in my own life, and I think led me to become a Christian. So starting with Lewis, and then Lewis often opens up lots of other authors as well. So the inklings at his time, his predecessors like George MacDonald and Chesterton, people who are more contemporary who are influenced by Lewis, that really got me hooked on philosophy of religion and just that way of thinking carefully and deeply about questions like, does God exist and where does morality come from? That once I started reading those folks, I was hooked right away. In fact, my senior year in high school, I started taking philosophy classes at a local college. I just wanted to get more of it, just kind of specialized exposure to it with an expert. And then from there, it just never left me. It's kind of sunk its teeth into me ever since. The interest in character, more specifically, that's been, I would say, a development in the last 10 years. I was intrigued by a debate going on in philosophy about the extent to which people actually have character, and if they do have a character, what does it look like? So, some people were actually questioning whether character even exists, or maybe it's just an illusion or a fiction. And they were saying, well, even if it does exist, how good is our character? Is it very virtuous? Is it very vicious? Or is it maybe something else altogether? And in order to engage in this discussion, they were reading a lot of psychology. So it wasn't just a philosophical discussion. They were bringing in lots of empirical data from studies that were being done in psychology, which could shed light on how good are we and what our character actually is like. That really fascinated me. I can say a lot more about it if you like, but that debate started, as I said, about 10 years ago. I got intrigued by it, and basically it's become my main interest these last 10 years.
I think another helpful piece of context before we get into the book would be to talk a bit about your work with the Character Project, which, based on what I read about it in the book, it sounds like this has consumed a significant part of your life maybe over the past decade or so.
That's correct. So I started getting interested in character in my professional life. I started writing papers, publishing them in journals, giving presentations at conferences, the kind of things that academics do normally. And that kind of escalated. I was writing more and more, and my work was getting out there. And then eventually I had a conversation with someone at the John Templeton Foundation, which is a leading funder of work in philosophy and other areas in the academic world. And together we had this idea of putting together a big team of researchers based at Wake Forest, where there are lots of other people working on character too, which would kind of be the leader in doing academic research on character from the perspectives of philosophy, psychology, and theology. Kind of bring those different perspectives, which are often isolated from each other, bring them together and really try and push the discussion forward, make new discoveries, and have some progress here. And lo and behold, it went forward. It was funded. We ended up working for 5 years on the character project, and we were funded in the amount of about $5.5 million. So it was one of the largest projects ever done in the world on character. And it had a multitude of outputs or research that came out of it that I think is really fascinating. We could spend the entire time just talking about what we learned. But just to give you a couple of highlights, in my own case, I ended up writing 2 academic books. The researchers I work with here at Wake Forest published dozens and dozens of studies. But one of the neatest things we did is that we funded almost 30 academic teams all over the world, young scholars who were just starting to get into the topic of character. We funded their research so they could get really invested and really deep into their research and produce new discoveries. Everything from work on when character develops in infants. So this team found that character is there as early as 9 months old in infants, that infants can discern between right and wrong and what's fair and unfair in their environment and adjust their behavior accordingly. Everything from that kind of study to the first book-length treatment of humility from a Christian perspective. So, wide range of different research that we funded, very exciting. It's still coming out in the journals and in the book publishers today. And it's one of the accomplishments of my professional life that I'm most proud of.
Well, thank you for just the broad range of context. It helps us to understand a little bit more what actually drives you and why you're so passionate about the work you do. One of the things I was thinking about in preparation for this interview, character-wise, what does that look like for the average person out there in society? Because, we all have an internal dialogue, and we often, I think, might sometimes think about ourselves maybe more positively than we need to. So what have you seen in your research? What does the average person actually think about themselves when it comes to character?
In my own research, the picture that's emerged that people tend to have a positive view of their character, maybe too positive. They tend to think that they're basically good people, that most of the time they're going to do the right thing. That everyone acknowledges that, yes, we slip up from time to time. We have some, guilt and wrongdoing in our past that we're ashamed of. But by and large, we're good, decent people. That's how we tend to think of ourselves. What really intrigued me is what's the reality? What actually is the case? Does our self-perception map on to what our character is actually like? And in my research over the years, in those two academic books I wrote, I came to think that our self-perception is a little askew, that in fact our character is often not as good as we think it is. It's not that we're wretched people, that we're, mired in vice and or have dishonest and cruel and callous characters. Some people do, of course. We know famous examples. But the picture that emerged for me is a picture of really mixed character, where we have some good sides to our character, for sure, but also some bad sides. And the bad sides can be quite bad in different situations. I can give you examples if you like. But the overall takeaway of this is we might think of ourselves as pretty good, but by and large, we're not.
Another thing I'm curious about, how has our definition of what is character, what is good character, how has it shifted in the past few decades? And maybe a way to unpack that might be to look at, when you talk about character, does that mean a different thing for a millennial versus a Gen Xer, say, versus a Gen Z person or a baby boomer. How do those different generations view character?
I don't know if I can break it down systematically by generation, but here's some general trends I think I've seen. So one thing is that the very concept of character is not as familiar today as it was in the past. And we could go back even further to Victorian days, for example. In the past, I think that was a familiar term. People would know what it meant. People would think it's very important. We would have lots of examples ready at hand of what character is. Today, when I talk to kind of younger generations, I often find I have to explain the concept first, and then people pick it up pretty quickly. But it's even more like an academic term or a little bit removed from ordinary experience. My better window into this or entry point into this is just to give examples of things like honesty. Well, okay, we all care about honesty. That's an example of character. Okay, then, I think character is important. Or compassion. Okay, well, we all care about compassion. Then I agree that character is important. And then a second point here is that what I find is that what is on the list of character traits has changed to some extent. So some, like honesty and compassion, those are pretty core and central. But others evolve over time. So chastity, for example, that's a pretty straightforward example. Chastity would have been considered a virtue and one of the most important virtues at an earlier time. Today, it's barely mentioned. Depends maybe on what circles you hang out in and who you tend to talk to. But in my kind of environment, in a more secular academic world, you almost never hear anyone talk about chastity. If you do, it's rarely as a virtue. So what the list of virtues might have some kind of core elements on it, like honesty and compassion, but it also has some that change over time, which from generation to generation.
Regardless of, say, where any of us might happen to fall on the character spectrum, for lack of a better way to describe it, what are some of the social boundaries that tend to keep us in check? Because, there are different pressures and expectations we all feel that might keep us from moving this way or moving that. So what does that look like?
I've also found in my research that social forces and social norms play a huge role in governing our behavior. And that can go in both ways. It can be for the good or for the bad. So maybe let me start with an example where it's not so good, that social boundaries actually push people to behave poorly. And this has to do with research going back to the 1960s on the group effect or the bystander effect. So in a kind of standard version of this experiment, a person would come in, sit down, fill out a survey. A stranger would come in, join them at the table, filling out the survey as well. The experimenter in charge would leave the room, go into the next room. A few minutes later, the participants could hear a crash. The experimenter has fallen off a ladder, is now screaming in pain. My ankle, I think I've broken it. Help me, I'm in terrible pain. And what does the participant do? Well, it depends now. This is the link to social boundaries and norms. It depends on what the other person does in the room with him or her. If you're filling out the survey and the person in the room with you does nothing, just keeps working on that survey, doesn't get up and help, doesn't acknowledge the pain of the other person in this room, you're very likely not going to help yourself. In fact, I can give you a quantitative result here. 7% of participants did anything to help when there was no response by that person in the room with them. Only 7% helped. So why? What's the explanation? Well, it's social forces. In particular, it's fear of embarrassment is a big part of the explanation. We don't want to do things which may embarrass us in front of other people. And in this particular case, if there's something that you're missing, some part of the story that you don't see, that would maybe say that there's a movie going on next door, or it's all part of an act, or you misheard what the other person's saying, and you jump up and go into the other room, you could look like a fool. You can embarrass yourself. So your fear of embarrassment in a social context keeps you from doing the morally right thing, the compassionate thing, which is to help someone else who's desperately in need of help.
Well, and one of the examples you gave in the book that was kind of sad was an example of, I believe it was Black Friday, and there was a gentleman who was having a heart attack and fell down in the store, and it took a long time for anybody to even help him. People just stepped over him, walked around him. What are the sorts of pressures you think that are at play? Is it just fear of missing out because of what you're there for, fear of feeling weird, or you don't know what to do? Unpack that situation for us a little bit.
Sure. So this is a real case. This is the case of Walter Vance, age 61, who this was late 2000, maybe I think 2008, 2009, was shopping in Target on Black Friday. He had a heart condition. He passes out on the floor of the store. The store is mobbed with people doing their shopping. As you said, nothing happens for quite a while. Eventually, some nurses notice what's happening, call 911. The ambulance takes him to the hospital. He dies on the way. What's going on? Well, this is actually a real-life example of what we were just talking about with the bystander effect. There are a couple factors here. One is, again, fear of embarrassment. Maybe there's something going on that I don't understand, I don't see in my environment, that would explain why no one else is helping. Maybe other people are clued into what's going on, and I'm not, and I want to make a fool of myself. Another factor is diffusion of responsibility. And because there are so many other people here in addition to me, I'm not going to take the blame myself. The responsibility and the blame, if there is something, if I do something wrong here, is going to be diffused or spread out over a variety of different people. And then, of course, the third thing that you already mentioned is, well, I don't want to miss out on this great deal. If I stop and help this person, then I might not get that TV, or I might not get that, whatever it is that I really desperately want here on Black Friday. Someone else might get it instead of me. So just base self-interest could override what's clearly the morally right thing to do.
Next, let's move into some of the information that you cover in the last part of the book. I think if you ask the average person point blank if they know what character is, even ask them if they'd like to improve their character, I suspect a lot of people are going to answer with a yes. What's the path forward for somebody who desires to make improvements to their character? And what might that look like depending on different worldviews? I think if you have a Christian worldview, that would look like one thing. But if you don't have a Christian worldview, that might entirely look different. So give us a couple of paths forward.
Sure. So let me take it in two parts. Let me talk about some secular strategies first, and then let's talk about some Christian ideas. So on the secular strategies, in the book I outline several. I won't go into all of them, but let me highlight two of them. One secular strategy, so if you're an atheist or an agnostic, but you still care about your character and want to become a better person, I think that's certainly possible. So you can be an atheist and have a very good character. It's not religiously required. One strategy you might want to pursue is to find admirable role models. So those could be historical role models or contemporary ones. They could be ones from fiction or from real life. They could be celebrities, or they could be people right next door to you in your hometown. But those are people who have the virtues to an impressive extent, such that when I look at their character, I see that it's very admirable, and I want to emulate it. And I'm inspired to try and become more like them. Not in every way. I can't become Abraham Lincoln. I can't become the President of the United States, but I can be inspired by his honesty and try to cultivate honesty more in my own character. So that's one secular strategy, role models. A second one is education, what I call getting the word out. So it's just learning more about some of the obstacles to being a good person. Those are obstacles that psychology in particular has disclosed to us over the last few decades. The one we've talked about a lot today has to do with fear of embarrassment. We may not have realized before these studies were done what a big factor fear of embarrassment can be in keeping me from helping other people. Once I learn that, once I educate myself and become better acquainted with the psychological literature, or at least just this fact about myself, then I can be attuned to it and try and counterbalance it or work against it, or make sure that it doesn't take priority over the suffering or needs of someone else in an emergency. So two secular strategies, role models, and getting the word out or educating ourselves. In the book, then I say those are valuable, that there needs to be more research. We need to think about them and develop them in more detail. But there are also religious strategies too. I mean, after all, throughout history, the majority of people have been religious. And religions have lots to say about character. In every case I know, they think virtue is really important. One of the goals of becoming a believer or a follower of that religion is to become a good person and develop the virtues. So we should consult these religious traditions and see what they have to say. And I pick Christianity in particular in the book for a variety of reasons. With talking to you today, I think your audience will be already familiar with what a lot of Christianity has to say about character development. But I highlight a couple of points in the book. One is that Christian practices and rituals, if followed carefully and thoroughly with a good intention and good heart, can have powerful character-building consequences. That's abstract, so let me make it a little bit more concrete. So if you tithe, for example, or if you just routinely give to the church, that can be very effective over time, becomes habitual, becomes second nature in fostering a virtue like generosity and working against a vice like stinginess. Or prayer, if done repeatedly over time, can work very effectively, I think, in fostering a virtue like humility and working against a vice like pride. Another point I really like to highlight is the social dimension of Christianity. That it's not you on an island trying to fix yourself and make yourself a perfect person. That's not going to happen. That's going to be very discouraging. And that you're part of a social community, a church, which has all kinds of resources and ways to come alongside you and help you in that process. Whether that's a small group, whether that's community worship, whether it's meeting one-on-one with a minister, whether it's reading about the wisdom of the past generations of Christians who have gone before us, it's done collectively with a lot of help. And then the final idea I really want to mention is that, again, it's not all up to us as human beings from a Christian perspective, that God is actually involved helping us become better people. This is an idea that's, I think, really powerful and unique to Christianity that you don't find as much, if at all, in other world religions. So this is the internal working of the Holy Spirit, how in the believer's life, the Holy Spirit is working to sanctify that believer, which part of what that involves is slowly bringing that person closer and closer to how he or she was designed to be in the first place. It's a process that doesn't end in this life, but it is a process that, according to Christianity, is happening through the work of the Holy Spirit in the psychology of the believer. And that's a powerful idea as well, I think.
Well, thank you for unpacking those different paths that we could look to take to pursue improving our character. You do some deep dives in the book and you cover a lot of ground, but if you had to sum it all up, when you think of readers getting to that last page, if they only take away, say, one macro or one big idea from the time they spend with your book, what do you most hope that is?
I don't know if I could boil it down to one idea, but I'll try. So I would say that character is important. Often our character is not very good, but there are concrete steps that we can take to try and improve it, and it's worthwhile going down that path.
As somebody who's interviewed and worked with hundreds of authors over the last several years, I know that every writing process is a journey. A lot of times an author learns a lot about themselves and is sometimes even changed in the process of bringing a book to life, if you will. So I'd be curious to hear for you, your journey with this book. Is there one big thing that you learned or a big change that you made in your own life after completing this work?
If I could actually say two changes. There's one that's personal, and then there's one that's professional. The personal one is that when I'm reading these studies, I often try and think about how they help me learn more about myself. So it's not just that I read about the group effect and I learn about the power of the fear of embarrassment, and I think, everyone else is like that, but I'm an exception. No, it's that I'm very much, guilty of this as well, and I could fall into those traps myself. So I learned quite a bit about who I am. Even though I'm a philosopher, I've been studying ethics for 20 plus years now. I had a lot of self-discernment that I needed to do and learned a lot about myself. And hopefully we'll take that and try and become a better person as well, and also be a better husband, a better father, a better role model for my kids, so that it has tangible implications for my personal life, which sometimes philosophy can be very abstract, very esoteric, but I really like the topic of character for the reason that it's so applicable, so practical, it's so personally relevant. And then the other big takeaway for me is that what's happened after this book has been published. I didn't know what the reception would be. I've never done a trade book. I've always done academic books in the past. And so I thought, well, is anyone going to read it? What's the takeaway going to be? And overwhelmingly, I've been encouraged by the fact that character still matters. And at time and again, people want to talk about this topic and, how good are we? What can we do to become better? Why does this matter? How can I use this in my own life and in the life of my kids and my family and my church and my school and my community? So I've been just blown away by the positive reception to the topic of character, and that's very encouraging to me.
Christian, for the listeners who want to connect with you and those who are interested in getting their own copy of the book, where can they go online to find you, and where are some of the best places they can pick up their book?
So the book itself is just available everywhere. Amazon will probably give you the best deal of all. I'm happy to also connect with listeners. I have a Facebook page and a Twitter account. Both are under Character Gap, one word, Character Gap. If anyone wants to pursue a deeper discussion, you can also just look up my website, email me. My email address is millerc@wfu.edu. I'm happy to give that out because it's public anyway. If you are thinking through the topic of character, want some more resources, just want to challenge some of the points I've raised, or just pursue them in more detail, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to carry out that conversation.
Well, and like we do with every episode, we'll be sure to have detailed show notes linked up. So once you're done listening to our conversation, just head on over to shauntabatt.com. We'll have links there where you can pick up your own copy of The Character Gap, and also links to some of the places that you can connect with Christian. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Christian B. Miller. Once again, our book today was The Character Gap, How Good Are We? Be sure to show your support by picking up a copy on Amazon or any other place where good books are sold. And Christian, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.